Hi all, I'm Jeanette Keynes from Jewelry Arts Inc. And in this video, I'm going to show you how to bezel set this gorgeous rectangular cushion shaped stone with a curved bottom. Lots of people find bezel setting a stone with a curved bottom a little tricky, so I'm going to show you how to do it with no problem. Now, if you look at this gorgeous little stone from the side, you see how it has a little tummy? We're going to need to make an inner bezel to hold that curved part up off the bottom of our setting, because otherwise when you set, it'll just like rock back and forth like a seesaw, which you don't want. So I'm going to take my dividers and measure and make a little inner bezel to hold it up. So if I make an inner bezel about this high, it should hold it off the bottom and keep me from having any issues when I set. You know, this is really important to check your stones for stuff like this, because it's very common for cabochons in particular to have a curved bottom, and it's no big deal to deal with it, but if you don't pay attention and put an inner bezel or a wire in there, you could have some serious issues with rocking when you set. And look, my inner bezel. So I usually just make mine out of fine silver, 26 gauge silver sheet. So you see, like, this is high enough to keep that little tummy off the bottom. So you see, and it honestly didn't need to be this high. I usually make my inner bezels a little higher than I need, because then I can just take them down accordingly, whereas raising them doesn't really work so well. And I soldered my little inner bezel shut, so it'll be easier to sand and everything. So you see, my inner bezel fits nicely inside my bezel, but it's not so crazy tight that I won't be able to get it in and out easily to check the height, because basically there's always a little bit of fine tuning right before you set to get the height just the way you want it. I'm also going to need to put underneath the inner bezel my nice shiny sheet, then I'll put the stone in and really see like what fine adjustments I want to make. Another thing to notice, after I soldered my inner bezel together, I sanded it really nice and flat top and bottom. If your inner bezel isn't level, it's going to cause a huge amount of issues, so that's really important. So I've placed my juicy stone in the bezel, and I'm pretty happy with the height. Show you a little side view there. See what I mean? I think that looks pretty good. Yeah, that looks good. So I'll show you the inside. As you may remember, I made a little inner bezel. You see how that's in there? So basically, I cut a beautiful shiny sheet of fine silver, 30 gauge fine silver that I'd already polished, put it on the bottom. I put my little inner bezel on top of it, just like so. Basically then pop my stone in. I ended up sanding down my inner bezel a little bit from how high I had it before. So pretty much now I'm ready to set. I'm gonna put the stone in. We'll look at it maybe from a couple other angles so you can really get a good look at it, but onto the bezel roller. There's one last look, but you see what I mean? That's ready to go. I'm gonna start setting. So I'm completely ready to set my stone now. Like I showed you in the close-up, the bezel height is good. Everything is in there nice and tight. I've got my little inner bezel holding that little curved tummy up off the bottom. My shiny silver's underneath, reflecting the light back up through the stone. So basically everything's exactly the way I want it. I made my bezel pretty tight, which is how I always do, so there's not a lot of extra gappage. But this stone has corners. They're not super sharp. They're a little slightly rounded, but they still are corners. So just like I'm sure you've heard me say before, corners always have to come first. So as usual, I'm using the bezel roller from my master setting tool set. Fits in the palm of my hand with my thumb and my forefinger on either side. I'm gonna have my elbow up in the air, because remember, you want your tool coming in at a 45-degree angle. I usually put like my thumb and my first finger basically holding the stone in place. Also, if I slip, that way I'll hit my fingers and not the stone, which my fingers will recover from a little ding. Depending on your stone, that's not always the case. These corners aren't really particularly sharp, so I mean, of course I'm going to do them first, but I don't really have to worry about not putting the tool directly on the point like you do when it's a really sharp point. This, I can really pretty much put my tool right on the point and then roll outward on either side. Okay, so you see, elbow up in the air, I'm going to press in and roll the extra space out. And essentially I'm going to finish up the corners before I do any of the rest of it. So I'm going to do the corner here, and then the corner over here, and then the corner here, and then the corner here. Do you know what I mean? Opposing presses, that's always kind of the easiest and most sensible way to approach your setting. I've got it in an engraving ball, which does help because then I can always like take it and press. Now this is not a faceted stone. It's way less likely to kind of wiggle around in the setting, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to keep an eye on it, because you got to kind of keep an eye on everything all the time, or stuff does naughty things. Okay, so then I'm going to go now to the one right across from it. Press in and roll that extra space out. Okay, and then I'll go to the other set, press in, because essentially just always remember whenever there's corners, you're immediately going to like sweep or press any extra room away from those corners. That's like the immediate thing, and essentially you never press extra space toward the corners because that's not where you want it. Okay, now go to the one across. Okay, I'll show you a little close-up so you can see what that looks like. It's not like I've done anything very exotic to it, but I've gotten rid of that extra space in the corners. Okay, so you see what I mean? You see how the extra space has basically been pressed in from all four corners. And the only place that there is extra bezel space now is in the long sides. You know what I mean? Like right in here, or maybe a tiny bit right in here. So now that I've got the points, I'll now start working on the rest of it. But I'm sure I've mentioned before, one of the most important elements of getting a good bezel setting is making your bezel nice and tight fitting to begin with, because that way I don't have to deal with all kinds of like extra space and gaps and things like that, and it makes it a lot faster when you go to set. Because you know, you saw me do that, you know, you saw me do all the corners, and that didn't take too long. Oh, there's the extreme close-up, and you see what I mean? No extra space in the corners, and that's what I'm going for. So now I'm going to go after the space that's left in between the corners. So now that I have the corners pretty tight, I'm going to go and squeeze in the little sections that are between the corners. Okay, you see, elbow up in the air, you press in and I roll back and forth. And I'm still not moving any of that extra space toward the corners. Okay, that's nice and tight. And you see, normally, whoop, everybody slips now and then. How I kind of press in and kind of feel, hopefully, for my footing, and then press a little bit harder. That keeps me mostly on the bezel. Okay, press in. I'll show you a little close-up. It's pretty tight now. More than likely what I'll do though, is I will do a little bit of that two-handed hammering technique, you know, where I'm gonna hold the bezel roller in my left hand, hold it up against the bezel, and do a little bit of tapping just to make sure it's, you know what I mean, squeeze really tight. But it looks pretty good. Let me show you the close-up. So I don't really see much space between the stone and the bezel. See what I mean? As I turn it, it's pretty tight up against there. I don't feel any wiggle. Well, that's a good thing. See what I'm saying? Like you don't really see any gaps there. But I'm gonna do that final round of my bezel roller held up high and just tap from the top just to make sure I'm filling any of those super tiny spaces that are not readily visible to the naked eye. Because like I said, if you look at this right here, this looks pretty good. So just a little more to go and I'm all done. Just to show you the side view as well. So you've probably seen me do this two-handed hammering technique at the end of setting to like finish tightening it up before, but if you haven't, so you're gonna hold your bezel roller in your non-dominant hand, which for me is my left. So what I do, wait, I'll switch myself around so you can just see my hand. I put the tool in my hand like so. Maybe I'll rest it right here, make it a little easier to see. And the end of my tool rests pretty much right in the middle of my pinky, because that way I can lay my pinky on the surface of whatever I'm working on and I can be really secure, you know what I mean? Because what I'm gonna do is do like this, rest the bezel roller right on top of the bezel and give it a few taps from the top. And a lot of this is just because it's not that I'm really hitting so hard, but I'm getting a much higher angle and a little extra leverage, and that's really what helps to finish this. Because this is not a case where you're gonna hear me like, wham, 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 wham. That's not this. This is a little more of a finesse procedure. So make sure you don't go too crazy, okay? Okay, so like I said, I've got the tool resting on my pinky, and then I take my tool and I rest it right on the edge of the bezel, and I pretty much hold the tool as high as I can without hitting the stone. So in other words, if my stone is like really bulbous and I need to lean it back a little bit, that's fine too. But essentially I want to get a pretty high angle like so. Okay. So I rest it on there, and then I take a leather mallet. Okay. And just that little extra bit of tapping will finish this up beautifully. And you know, really listen to the sound. This is not a case of going really berserker with the hammer. Because basically I start in a spot and I just roll it a little bit, and I'm gonna work my way around. Now this little maneuver is going to take you a little time to get used to. Obviously, it takes practice to kind of get control of everything, but don't worry, if you keep at it, I promise, it gets easier and easier. And basically, I'm at the point now where it looks done to me. I'll probably do a little more just because I'm a little OCD, but I really don't see any spaces. I don't feel any wiggle. I'm gonna go around a little more just to be absolutely sure. And then I'll do a little close up for you. Well, there it is in all its glory. Hopefully you can see. Don't see any gaps or anything. See what I mean? It's all smoothed out and nice and tight. So really all I have to do now is I'm going to use one of the polishing wheels from my Bezel Settings polishing kit, and give it a little bit of shine right up top, but that's pretty much all it needs. If you haven't noticed the theme of all of these videos, it's always like everything is about your prep. If you do your prep work the way it should be, the actual process, like setting the stone or soldering or whatever, is actually really quick. It's when you don't get those preliminary steps right that things get very tricky. So there you go. I'm going to polish a little bit and it'll be on its way to Susie. So except for a little polishing, basically I'm done. Normally, to clean up the little slip marks you get on the side of the bezel, I put my finger over the stone, or you could tape it up, and use a little green paper. You know, this green micron paper is like my favorite because it gives like a nice finish. I don't even know what the right word for it. It's sort of a satiny finish, but you know, those words can mean a lot of different finishes. It's not super shiny, but I just think it looks really good with the high carat gold. And I'm just making sure that my finger is covering up the stone, because this is definitely aggressive enough that it'll start to take the shine off my beautiful tourmaline, and I don't want that. So like I said, either your finger is covering the stone or tape or something, but I usually just go around and do that, and it just cleans up any of those little slip marks. Doesn't take much at all. And the rest of this ring is already the way that I want it to be polished, so there's really nothing to do there. Yeah, I think that did it. So I'm just going to take my Swifty wheel now and I'm going to give the top of this a couple passes to get a shiny edge, but then that's it. So always remember, when you're using your micro torque or your flex shaft or whatever, arms nice and resting on the table so that you're really comfortable. I hold it in my right hand, you know, whatever your dominant hand is. Got my thumb out because then my thumb can brace itself either on my hand or the piece itself, and that way everything stays really braced, which is essential for polishing. And then I'm just going to run this really just along the very top of the bezel. The rest of this ring already looks pretty much how I want it to look, so that's really all it takes. I really love this stone. It's so juicy. It's like a watermelon candy. And it's one of the reasons why I don't really bother with calibrated stones. I mean, there are certainly scenarios where you're like, yes, I need 10 3mm stones, you know, blah, blah, blah for your design. But if you only pick out calibrated stuff, you're never going to work with gorgeous one-of-a-kind stuff like this. And that, to me, since I make one-of-a-kind handmade jewelry, is kind of the point. So don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to embrace the one-of-a-kind stone cuts. They're way worth it. Now, if I get a shiny spot on the side because I slip with my wheel, I'll just go back over it with a little bit of my green paper real quick and take that shine back down. I'll show you the finish when it's all done. I mean, you know, polishing is one of those things. There's no real right answer. It's whatever you think looks good to you. It can depend on the kind of metal you work in and just what you like and whatever. So normally I tell people, like, you know, on the bright side, rarely what you do in polishing is permanent. If you don't like it, you can always just, you know, take the shine down, bring the shine further up. You know, you can always adjust until it looks good to you. Well, there it is, all shiny and finished, ready to go off to Susie.